What does Jared Diamond tell us about human sexuality? That it's only in humans and not in other animal species. That we are outliers in terms of our sexuality. And then he lists a bunch of different ways in which we are unique. We're different from other animals in how we have sex. And he wrote this whole book called Why is Sex Fun? Because it seems to be that humans are one of the few creatures that just have sex for fun, not necessarily for reproductive reasons. My feeling, though, is I feel like this is way out of date. It is true that humans are sexually different, but my own opinion is I'm not a big Jared Diamond fan on this one, and I don't like how it's represented. And the reason I don't like how it's represented is I believe that if you look at biologically at different creatures, the reason human beings have been portrayed as outliers in terms of their sexuality is that biologists have mostly, for the most part, concentrated on reproductive sex. And that's because that's the only thing that matters for biologists, because they're interested in evolution. And so they want to know what's going to happen in the next generation. And so the only thing they care about is sex that leads to reproduction. If you do that, then you miss all the ways in which other creatures are doing all these other funny things that are not reproductive, including same-sex activity. And so there's a better book that's been written called Evolution's Rainbow, which talks about how if you looked at what other animals are doing in a more broad sense and looked beyond just simply reproductive sex, you'll find a whole bunch of different things that is going on. I would say that I do agree that humans are a little bit are weird in some ways in terms of their sexuality, but maybe not as much as we think. There's another person that comes in here who I just don't get what she's doing there. So there's Helen Fisher. Fortunately, nobody told us about her, but she wrote this book called Why We Love: The Nature and Chemistry of Romantic Love. And she is an anthropologist, and she gets a lot of press for doing chemistry stuff. And if you type into your browser, if you just type in chemistry.com, let's say you were interested in chemistry and you typed in chemistry.com, the thing that pops up is a dating site. Now, I'm not sure what the chemists Not sure what all the chemists would think about this. Their whole discipline has been appropriated. If you type in chemistry, you're going to get to meet other singles near you in Oneonta. And sure enough, it's been done with the help of Helen Fisher, who will get you a personality test, and then you can go through and match with other people. And so, as Guest describes, she talks about these neurochemicals that guide us through three distinct phases of falling in love. Now, if this is what sexuality and love and all that stuff is about, we really don't need anthropology. We just need some neurochemicals and some biology, and we can go up and learn about this. Now, if you type in anthropology.com, I'm not sure if it's better or worse what pops up. I always have to check. Oh, yes, they bought us. They bought the whole discipline off, and they'll sell you nice looking dresses and expensive gifts, and you can have that anthro magic. This is what I should be selling. That's what I should be doing. What am I doing up here? Getting old, I don't even have a restaurant. I could be selling you towels and stuff like that. So I'm not sure who has it worse, the chemists or the anthropologists, but we've both been bought off. The point of this chapter is actually, though, after he tells you about that, he says that most of this chapter will concentrate on what he calls a second school of thought. So if the first school of thought was that that your sexuality is determined by chemicals and stuff, what do we think is crucial to not determining our sexuality, but influencing our sexuality? Our environment. What kind of environment? What do you mean by that? Environment you grow up in. So I would say that anthropologists tend to emphasize how like gender, our sexuality is shaped by our culture. Now, that doesn't mean that we can shape our kids' sexuality by giving them a particular toy to play with or a doll to play with. It doesn't work like that. In fact, a lot of sexuality, obviously, there's going to be something personal to do to that. Again, I can't make my kids I can't make them any way, but how you will express yourself, how you will be seen if you do a certain thing versus if you do something else is all about our society. It's all about what we sanction as an identity, what we encourage people to do. And again, this isn't from obviously individual behavior matters, but trust me, I can't make my kids do something just because I give them a fire truck to play with instead of a doll. Doesn't work like that. Now, at the last section of this, Jess says, and is thinking like an anthropologist, that anthropology may not be able to help you decide whom to date or when to do what and where. And I just want to make clear that I want to be a little bit stronger about this. We cannot help you decide whom to date or when to do what and where. Do not ask me about that, and do not say that I ever told you anything about it, because I can't say anything about it. What we can do, though, is talk about the shaping of sexuality from a larger cultural perspective. So this first of all has to do with how we define sexuality. So Guest says that sexuality refers to a complex range of desires, beliefs, and behaviors that are related to erotic physical contact, intimacy, and pleasure. Now, I've underlined the word erotic physical contact because, in fact, what counts as an erotic physical contact, or what is typed as erotic, is actually itself culturally variable. So in our society, we tend to see bare female breasts as erotic or something like that. Taboo. Not in New York State, I forgot what we do with that. You're not supposed to just be walking around like that. But in other societies, that might not count as erotic at all. It has nothing to do with erotic physical contact. And Guest says that secondly, it's the cultural arena within which people debate ideas of what kinds of physical desires and behaviors are morally right, appropriate, and natural. So, like in other instances, we grow up with these ideas. I again underline the word debate because people talk about them and they do debate, but certain things they start to fall outside of debate and they get to be considered the natural way of doing things. If we look around at another society or another culture, that might not be considered to be natural. Something very different might be considered to be natural. Thirdly, he says that sexuality is also connected to ideas of status, power, privileges, and resources. Now, one of the things that's interesting is, again, what counts as erotic varies from society to society, but it also varies in our own society. And what counts as having sex might actually be different even within our own society. This is a famous episode in which Bill Clinton addressed the country, and he said, "I did not have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky." And actually, the way Monica Lewinsky was treated and all this was terrible, but we're just now understanding that. And then, for some reason, he got impeached for lying about that. Politics was very different back then. It seems like people get impeached for the strangest things. But back then, people who were of the older generation, when it found out that there was indeed oral sex, they said, well, he must have been lying about that. But as our book says, if you surveyed college students at that time, many of them, or a majority, would say that that wouldn't be considered having sex. So again, I don't want to get too much into this, but the point of the matter is that the meaning of what is considered erotic or what is considered having sex can actually vary within our own society as well. And so this brings us to a crucial point, which is about the things that people do or actions and their connection or not to identity. Now, I first want to make a point about sexuality. Most of the things that people do with regard to sex are not reproductive sex. Oh, if you looked all across what people are doing, most of it is non-reproductive, so it doesn't result in anything, even if you don't count self acts. And there are lots of things that people do with each other, same-sex acts, that are not necessarily associated with an identity or not latched on to identifying as something or not. So it's only recently in human history, the idea that you are, this is your identity, that you would say, I am heterosexual or I am gay. That's a relatively recent idea. How long ago? When do we hear about heterosexuality? Yeah, around, that seems to be the first time this word is used, so not very long ago. And so the whole idea that people would identify as this or that is a fairly recent idea. And so again, if we just looked at the activity involved, you would say that there are people doing heterosexual stuff and homosexual stuff and other sexual stuff in all societies, but doesn't necessarily carry an identity as such. It is also true that many societies across the world have had long-term same-sex unions, but they aren't necessarily a part of a sanctioned experience. And even in our world, ideas of who and what homosexual or heterosexual is quite socially variable when you look at different places. So a number of you brought up different parts of the world here where we see different ideas about what counts, like in Gloria Wekker's work in Suriname, which is used to be a Dutch colony in northern South America. So you have these same-sex relationships, and what Wekker wants us to say, though, or she wants to say, is that we shouldn't project our own ideas of this as a homosexual identity onto that society, because it's something that is in some ways they do, but is not, they don't necessarily identify as homosexual or heterosexual. These are activities that have their own specific cultural role. Another place where this comes up and is interesting is in Nicaragua and in many parts of Latin America. You could be a man and engage in what we would consider to be homosexual activity, but as long as you were the penetrator, you maintain your identity as a heterosexual man. And so that would be an instance of machismo. And so the only people who would be labeled homosexuals would be people who would be penetrated. That would be homosexuality. I feel like this is a sub-theme in our own society as well that doesn't get talked about as much, because now you're supposed to identify, in part because you're supposed to identify as one or the other. I kind of agree with that. But again, it's an instance in which the whole even identification can be different between and within the society. Then there's another interesting example from a book called Nightwork, Sexuality, Pleasure, and Corporate Masculinity in a Tokyo Hostess Club. It more seems to be about the relationships that men are developing in the workplace than it is really about the whole sexuality aspect of this. So once again, another example from different parts of the world where our notions of sexuality might be quite different from society to society. Going back to the idea of inventing heterosexuality, which I think is a great way to put it. Often people talk about inventing homosexuality and the identity that happened after World War II, basically in the United States. But this also happened in some ways, or happened in the United States, the invention of heterosexuality. So one of the things that contributed to this were these studies by a discipline that was called sexology that basically went around talking to and interviewing US white people. What did they find? More fluid than they thought. Yeah, I mean, here they were going around and talking to to people in the United States. This is like the 1950s and stuff, and they thought they were going to find pretty rigid ideas. And it actually demonstrated there was this surprising fluidity, range and continuum, even among white US people. However, I think sexology or the study or guess says that it did contribute to this invention of heterosexuality because that's the way that most people were having sex. And so that was considered to be, okay, that's the normal way. So it did document this range of activity, but it did also contribute to this idea that heterosexual sex was the normal thing to do. Amplifying that was the wedding industry. What does the wedding industry do for us? Sells you a fairy tale, sells you this idea of what things should be like and who should have access to being married. What's interesting is how much that fairy tale was sold to people, but is now off limits or it doesn't work as much. And so there's an interesting book called Sexual Citizen, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus that talks about the difference in age between when people usually have sex and when they get married. So some of that we might say is maybe good, right? That you extend out that period. But what these authors claim is we haven't really adjusted our cultural concepts to go with that distance as much as we should. So yeah, it used to be it was pretty close together, those two things. It might be good, but I do think we need to adjust our ideas, maybe us old people as opposed to the young people. I also think that one of the reasons people don't get married today is because they don't have the resources to get married, because they don't have enough money. At the end of this, another interesting study about Mexican gay men. Wait, the sexual migration of Mexican gay men. Yeah, no, this is a really interesting study. For the most part, the migration patterns that we see are often economic. But in this case, it was about sexual expression and desires and different ways that people are seeking a different life in other places.